All right, so today we're going to kind of brief through some different types of irrigation systems and more specific to agriculture, right? I know that there's kind of, this bouncing back and forth, and this applies more in residential, commercial, or turf. We'll just say residential and turf grass. Well, these systems that I'm going to talk about, as opposed to most of the sprinkler types that I was showing you guys the other day, like the MP rotator, or let's see, I had some pop-up, fixed sprays, some pop-up rotator types, which again, the MP rotator, the rotor type. And really it does kind of, in time you start looking at these different sprinkler types. It's just something that's crossing my mind right now, and what I'm thinking about is that I've had the thought that it seems kind of strange, actually, that something like we'll say the rotor with that, it's throwing out a band. It can throw one out a chute in some cases, and on golf courses we have rotor sprinklers that throw out 100-foot band, or 50, 75, whatever. In an agriculture system like Handline we'll talk about, generally these pipes are 40 feet long and they have a sprinkler that throws out 40 feet. But the question is, why are we using impacts and R33s, like we talked about the other day, compared to the rotor type? And I think the best explanation that I can think of, because they all disperse water, give us a synthetic rain, is that minimal maintenance, or the fewer moving parts, especially on large scale when we may be running hundreds at a time. Just I guess in terms of maintenance and preventive maintenance type of stuff, we don't see a rotor or gear-driven sprinkler, spaced out every 40 feet by 40 feet on over large acres. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't retrofit or adjust a system to do that if we, I guess, had the desire to. So I start with Handline because I do feel like that's probably the only type of irrigation that that comes to mind is more long-standing than Handline, because it is very old, an old system. It would probably be flood irrigation, and that comes in a lot of different, different methods of doing flood irrigation. But Handline irrigation still goes on. It's very high maintenance. Just as well, we'll say high labor costs, because this is moved by hand, versus most of our other systems that are either that are mechanically or motorized, and helping with that moving aspect of it. I guess we'll say that what comes to mind as a benefit to Handline irrigation, and why folks continue to do it, is that it's cheap as far as the parts and pieces are concerned. I've actually done the math several seasons now to show my uncle that it would be much cheaper for our crops, at least, to use a wheel line in most cases, where we're using Handline, just because we would pay that. We generally pay more in labor for the Handline movers than we would for a wheel line system. But not necessarily speaking to the efficiencies of the labor, but my favorite aspect of Handline is that it gives the grower, unless if they're the ones doing it, I guess, which isn't always the case, but it gives me as a grower, when I move Handline, the opportunity to scout my field very thoroughly. Every 40 feet I'm stopping and picking up pipe, and I'm getting down close to the plants, and I pick up that pipe and I'm looking at the saturation of the soil beneath it. And in a lot of cases I'm trudging, I try not to water so much that I'm trudging through mud. But with that labor aspect of Handline, it's very common that the system is almost, I wouldn't say arbitrarily, it's ran for 12 hours to accommodate scheduling personnel. A 12-hour irrigation set, or 24s, or things that make it easy to schedule, aren't always the best agronomic option for the plant. But again, for that personnel aspect, it happens an awful lot. But again, going back to spending time in the field in terms of pest management, or just knowing your field, knowing your ground and soil types and such, you can't help but learn an awful lot about your field. And when I changed Handline, and the guys that work for me in the summertime, I always mention that when you're out in the field and you see weeds, especially if it's like a localized kind of concentrated area of weeds, we either flag it or we pull them out by hand while we're there. That sort of speaks to the economics of using a chemical for weed control versus just pulling them while we're there. But again, I kind of mentioned, hey, if this is a concentrated area, you see a whole bunch of plants of the same, or weed varieties, pull them while we're there, and that's primary versus depending on the schedule that we're on. But again, it all relates to just being in the field, and that's what I like best, and almost specifically about Handline irrigation. So, lightweight pipe. This is aluminum pipe. This is a short section. Sorry for those online. Maybe I'll get my phone out and upload an extra YouTube video after class showing what we're all looking at right now. But this is aluminum pipe, mainly just to save us some weight. This is a 10-foot section, roughly. We've got about a 6.5 span. Yeah, I'd say this is a 10. We have some 8s and 12s and 10s. I brought this short one just to get it in here, but most of our pipe are 40 feet long. That's significant in that's what's determining my spacing between sprinkler heads, is that 40-foot section of pipe. And so we can make an assumption that if we're properly fitting our Handline pipe, that the sprinklers have about a 40-foot radius, so that we'll get more into it, but head-to-head coverage. It's not meeting in the middle that's important with water. With that trajectory of water, it's going from one sprinkler head all the way to the other sprinkler head. And I think that we can all imagine, with a stream of water flying through the air, that there's a sort of a uniformity issue of sorts in that amount of water dispersion over that radius or that distance that it's throwing to. And so, to the best extent that we can with sprinklers, they are designed so that they sort of complement one another in how they overlap, sort of weaving their dispersion together for a uniform application. Considerable amount of labor and hard work under less than favorable conditions. Again, going back to, so not just that personnel scheduling aspect, but if we were to run for 12 or 24 hours to make it easy to schedule, then of course, we end up saturating the field, and that the difference between moving Handline over dry ground or just wet ground that you're not sinking into. In some cases, I've honestly been through some real kind of somewhat powdery, we'll say, areas in a field that's been overwatered. And it seems crazy, but this one guy that helps me, this guy's 60 years old, and I can't change pipe as fast as he can. It's crazy. It's so efficient. I swear to God, he takes the same amount of steps. Everything is just so mechanical. He's fast, but he always told me to walk on my heels, and it works. But you're walking on your heels, holding a 40-foot piece of aluminum Handline in mud, trying not to lose your boots. There's very likely there will be some amount of water in most of the pipe that you pick up, unless it's on a hill and it's drained out. But you're going to get into some pipe that have a ton of water in it, and it's just very, very laborsome and physical, the high physical demand. Last season, or the season before last, I had 12 different people help me throughout the season, and it wasn't because I needed 12 people, it was because I couldn't keep one person, just because it sucks so much, And I was doing pretty short sets, but I was growing a soybean crop, which later on in the season was over my knees, up to my waist in some areas. And so now you're at least maybe not, you're sort of trying to step over or step between rows with everything else that's going on, and then finding the place. So we'll say I'm moving this Handline. That latch there that's hanging down to my right, that would slide into another piece of pipe into this end, and then that latch goes over. And then you kind of pull it back, sort of twist it, But when you've got a lot of foliage on the ground or a lot of plants in the way, and you're 40 feet away, well, you're probably more like 25 feet away because you get a little bit closer to the sprinkler end. And you're trying to, one, find the line to hook up to. Then when you get there, trying to get it close. And in some cases, I know I've got some handline movers in here. Some folks have had some experience. You get some growers or some folks or even yourselves, you can sort of expedite the process by leaving the water running a little bit. They call that, like, I've always heard that called like dry versus wet, so like changing the lines wet. Still got some water coming through. So you're trying to hook up sometimes with water coming through, trying to find the spot and to get the latch, and you're feeling for it, listening for it, and you get pretty good. But still, all the while, if you're close, you've got water coming into this pipe that you're holding, and it's getting heavier and heavier. You start to panic because you think you're not going to get the latch. And anyway, the costs of changing pipe by hand definitely increase as the season goes on, just because the difficulty just increases in a lot of cases. It's fun. I mean, sometimes. Yes, yeah. Sometimes I felt like a coach giving a motivational speech before we did it. And the way I ran water, it was usually an 8-hour set. We'll say throughout the whole season. I battled with my uncle for the scheduling, but I normally ran about an 8-hour set on average, we'll say. And that meant that theoretically I could be there 3 times a day. Right? We didn't, but we did move pipe twice a day. And basically it was showing up at 5. The lines would usually be set by 6, turning the water on, letting it run for 8 hours. So that would get me into 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Now I had to find somebody to turn off the water, which isn't always easy to do at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is a strong point for running it for 12 hours. But if I could maybe run out there, get the water shut off, and then come back a few hours later and the ground wasn't as freshly watered and as soft, we could save some time. But yeah, so then water was normally, just considering the fact that we'd be there at 5 a.m. the next time. If it was an 8-hour set, I got it back planned, so that means somebody's got to be turning on water at 9 p.m., which again is not convenient. And that was what my uncle was telling me was going to happen if I didn't do 12-hour sets. As we talk more about how we can adjust, or I guess engineer our systems, if I was to go through this whole process again in terms of irrigation scheduling and trying to make things as efficient as possible, what I would do is probably figure out a way to run for 12 hours. And the best way I can figure to do that is to adjust the nozzle, the output of my sprinkler. So versus, this is, and here's a good example of stuff that gets plugged in those nozzles. And this looks like it might have been intentional. Sometimes folks do that just to have an extension, but not necessarily water coming out. But I would have to swap out that nozzle for one that, I suspect that's a 5/32 inch orifice, which under 40 psi is only 5 gallons per minute. If I back that off to maybe 3 gallons a minute with a different nozzle, then I could run for a longer period of time and make the scheduling aspect easier. And as far as the irrigation or agronomic aspect, that would be a more efficient application with water. Same amount of water, just over a longer period of time. Sort of speaks to those efficiency gains with the MP rotator versus the fixed spray head. Run it for twice as long, you get 30% more water, just because for the most part we're not losing any to runoff or pooling on the top, which makes it vulnerable to evaporation. This stuff these guys are carrying here, it's interesting how cultural irrigation is. This is pretty commonly used down in California. I think it has good application up here, but that's a sort of a polyurethane synthetic material that at the ends, those couplers, they attach with a good leak-proof seal so that when the water lines are shut off, they don't drain. It's really good for what we call solid set, which is leaving a portable system in place. Generally speaking, that's what the solid set is for a long period of time. So in other words, when the water is shut off to be moved or just to stop irrigating, where these junctions are at, the unions between pipe, if it's not sealed, that pressure decrease and velocity decrease of the water is just anyways, that water is just going to slowly leak out of those places and saturate those areas where we had the pipe. At the end of a season, with an aerial view, you can generally see those areas where the pipe come together, because we don't see as healthy of a crop there just because of that real saturated area. Okay, so it eliminates that, but that stuff is called Certipipe. Yeah, again, it would be really handy for that solid set irrigation system without draining out water and kind of allowing for a much faster startup without having to prime an entire system with water. Okay. I'm not really too concerned. I'm not concerned at all with you guys getting to know this. If there's anybody that wants to, I don't know, just thinking about, what I want you guys to take from this is that this is very laborsome, and it can still be efficient, but I want you guys to have an idea of what sort of things to be considering when you're irrigating with Handline. Another thought is that those locations where the pipe is laid out and we're irrigating, because we're going to move it, it's going to be a while before we get back to that same location. So if we're not checking that each sprinkler is applying water, in other words, we don't have any plugs down the line. If we look down look at the end of our line when it's all running, and invariably, it just happens, especially with Handline, you end up with some heads that are kind of turned, laid over a little bit. It may not seem like a big deal, but with that mentality that it's going to be, again, a long time before you get back to that spot, I'm going to be blasting, right next to the head on one side that it's angled toward. I'm going to be shooting it up into the air, throwing it further, messing up sort of my dispersion and my uniformity with the other heads on the other side. And if we have something like a plug nozzle or a laid overhead, or we end up having the system that sometimes the couplers weren't attached quite right, you get a blowout, it separates, and all your water is just flooding out of that one open area in your system. You have the choice to make of either irrigate again, which isn't probably going to be a great thing for a good part of the field to be irrigated consecutively like that, too much water, I'd say, in most cases, or moving on and dealing with your loss. So if anybody knows any CrossFitters that really want to push themselves this spring, send them my way. Okay. Okay. Sort of explain the coupling device. They're not all exactly the same. I want to say that this is generally called a Western latch. What's important is that you have all of these latches or couplers of the same type. Other things to look for in terms of uniformity is that you have all nozzles that are matching. Okay, not some that are 3 gallons a minute and some that are 6 or whatever. Keep it uniform, and it's really easy for that stuff to get out of whack. Somebody replaces a bent piece of pipe and it has a different coupler. Somebody replaces a nozzle or replaces a sprinkler head or whatever, and they're just using what's in their pocket to fix the problem. And when I first started managing our water on the farm, I spent 2 days just going through and making sure that every piece of pipe had a good riser that wasn't bent, that I had a functional sprinkler head, that my nozzles were matched, and there were probably 6 different nozzle sizes, and it probably has been irrigated like that for, well, no doubt, not probably, it has been irrigated without that uniformity for a long time. One thing that I'll, historically, when my uncle irrigates, and he's basically a dryland wheat and pea farmer, 2 crops that with ideal conditions don't need any supplemental water around here. He would still, in the areas that we had water available, water in the fall pretty often, just get some groundwater saturation or the best he could, and then maybe again in the spring. And so a person or an operation can usually get by almost unnoticed with poor uniformity if they're applying so much water that really the only measurable difference is what we would see at significant, depths, where maybe in one case we're watering a foot deep, another case it's 6 inches, and another case it's 18 inches. That doesn't really appear in a lot of cases right away, and sometimes not at all. But it's still a waste of water. And and I'll tell you what, I know that there will be a day soon that irrigation systems are going to have to meet a certain efficiency level. And if somebody wants to continue using Handline, you're going to have to be able to show that you're doing the best that you can with probably lower output sprinklers. There's going to be meters on pumps so we know how many gallons per minute are coming out. It's going to be good stuff for the irrigation scheduler, but not good stuff for the guy that doesn't want Uncle Sam or any of his agents on the property checking meters and checking, but it's going to happen, okay? So look into efficiency upgrades now, because we will all be experiencing the requirement here. Okay, so some common fittings with Handline up there on the top. I guess technically speaking, I'd never heard it called a valve opening elbow. I'd always just called it a riser valve, but nonetheless, our water access points with Handlines are normally risers in the field. They are rising from the main line that's beneath the surface. That's where we call them a riser. We also call this piece right here a riser. It's a general term in irrigation for a vertical extension off of the main line to elevate the water application. Okay, so we would drop one of those valve opening elbows on top of a riser. Has that same type of coupler as the rest of the pipe do, and then we start laying it out across the field. Okay, in some circumstances, we want to maybe tee off of a main. We would call this a lateral, so a tee. That might be necessary. A 90-degree elbow, they make 45s as well, but they give us the ability to obviously change that line that we're running to. And I'll tell you what, it is an art, in my opinion, or it's respectable, at least in the irrigation Handline world, if you can look down a line and see that it's straight. With practice that comes, but initially, it just looks like this snake. It's all over the place, and again, uniformity, and it's going to be a while before you get back there. So try to cover your gaps, and my method is generally, I'd be on this end, but it's like finding that latch, hooking it up, make sure I've got in there, and then I grab onto this riser and lay it down. I give it a tug to make sure that I am still hooked on, but then at that point I'm also kind of doing that as if you're driving a tractor, or actually I like to say, sometimes maybe a better analogy is if you're being followed by a cop and you just look way out there, so you're not looking right off your nose and zigging and zagging. If you look out there and look at your line, your risers should probably be able to help you out and see that you're staying in a straight line. It'll look good in the end. But our next set is going to be a lateral move, maybe 40 feet, maybe 60 feet. But if we're snaking, the idea that we're going to be snaking exactly like that with the next move is pretty unlikely. Okay, I didn't know that this slide was coming. K-line, anybody ever used it? It's basically that black can, so to speak, is on the ground, and it's got a sprinkler head that pops up above it. It's all flexible hose that connects all the different cans with sprinklers in them, and it's similar with Handline in that it's moved frequently, but the whole idea is that you can hook up to that with a vehicle, four-wheeler or something of that nature, generally four-wheeler. Best for pasture, not really a great option for a row crop, not an option for a row crop in my opinion, but pretty slick and some newer innovation that's come out in irrigation for mainly I've only seen it used in pasture. Okay, so we've got 20 minutes left in the class. You guys want to just go out there and check out the pivot? It will probably be out there a little bit over, like maybe 5 minutes or something. You can roll out as soon as it's time. So let's just go outside. I've had that in mind, and I'm going to kind of skip ahead. tomorrow I'm going to probably bounce back to the Handline a little bit when we just look at what solid set irrigation is and how to set that up. But I just want to go outside.